All right, Lucy, do you wanna jump on, get your video and audio going?
Hello.
Also, I feel like I've got my chocolate, but I started eating it and it's really chewy. Like I'll share with everyone. So turns out Lucy likes making decorative cakes,
Mhm.
and we were chatting about it before we were gonna get going, and I ended up wanting to eat a cake. So now I've got a chocolate bar. And
You got
it's
a crave.
way too chewy to work with the webinar format, so I'll see how I go. But yeah, maybe you could tell us just while we're just waiting for a few more people to join. So would love to know, like, what is it about cake making that you like?
Hmm. I'm really into the like layer cakes that are really decorative that you see on Instagram. So the actual baking of the cake is not my favorite part. It's the decorating it that I really like.
Okay,
Um,
okay.
it's quite difficult, but it's a really satisfying challenge because you get something really nice at the end, really beautiful that is very impressive.
Yeah,
Um, but you learn all these little techniques to make it, like heating up the knife to get a nice smooth edge,
yeah, okay.
these little things. So I love that it's something you can practice and get better at each time you do it.
Yep,
But every time I do it, I end up with a huge cake because they're really big
yeah,
that I have to eat most of. They do taste good, but we have to
yeah.
be careful with how much cake
Yeah,
we.
yeah, it's a difficult hobby, I guess. It's kind of
It's rough.
my sausage making hobby. You can't a good sausage is
It's-
like, at least in my view, like 50% fat, and that's not a great like thing to be doing on a daily basis.
Yeah, not many parties this year where you can share these kinds of things.
Yeah, 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 yeah. All right. Um, Now, yeah, well, Juliana, that is exactly what happened to me. We got talking about it. So quickly go and grab your brownies, chocolates. Yeah, this is not a good way to start, or maybe a good way depending on your point of view. But let's get into it. So we're here to talk about conducting excellent customer interviews today, and we've got Lucy Denton with us from Dovetail. Um, Dovetail is a customer research platform, so kind of like right at the forefront here, which is fantastic. Do you want to just kick to the next slide, and then I'll just do a quick intro. So I'm Scott. I'm the CEO and founder of Terum. We're a product development firm. We've been on the AFR Fast 100 2 years in a row. We just love delivering products for our clients and with our clients. I've been involved in a stack of product launches, loves making sausages, sailing. But one of the things I love the most is these sessions that we do where I get to pick the brains of some of the top people in Australia and globally as well when it comes to product and the different aspects of developing products. So yeah, we got Lucy here today. I've had the good fortune of being interviewed by Lucy when Lucy was at Atlassian. Customer interviewed by Lucy. It was a very good interview. So I'm pretty excited about going through this because I know Lucy's very good at what she does. Yeah, I'm going to get out of the way now and hand over to you, Lucy. Fire away.
Oh, thank you so much for that kind intro. I'm glad you enjoyed our customer interview experience. Um, as Scott said, I'm a senior UX designer or product designer here at Dovetail. We're a startup based in Sydney. And if you aren't familiar with Dovetail, the product, as Scott said, it's a customer research tool aimed to help teams collaborate, analyze, and centralize their research. So the idea is you can use Dovetail to analyze your customer interviews and find themes with your team, and then you can store all your data in one place so you can refer to that data later on. But today I'm going to be talking about how to run customer interviews. Many people think that a customer interview is just a simple conversation with another person, but there's actually a lot more that goes into running a good customer interview than people realize in order to get those insights that you're looking for to help you make product and business decisions. So today I'm going to share some qualitative research theory and techniques that will hopefully help you upskill your customer interview skills in your own teams. But before I get into that, I wanted to talk a little bit more about when to use customer interviews and qualitative research in general. When wanting to learn about customers and how people use our products, many people turn to quantitative research, such as product analytics, surveys, perhaps metrics from A/B testing. And these methods give us numbers that describe some aspect of the user experience. So for example, you might look at your product analytics and determine that a particular feature isn't used very much, or maybe a particular page on your website doesn't get much traffic. So quantitative data is usually used to determine scale, like how many customers are affected by a particular problem, and they allow us to compare numbers. But qualitative research, on the other hand, helps us to discover problems and investigate the why behind the quantitative data. It can also give us some insight into how to fix those problems. In your practice, you should really use qualitative and quantitative research methods together because they really tell us very different things about the user experience. There are a huge number of qualitative research methods to choose from, but customer interviews are one of the most common, and I think they're one of the most versatile methods. So that's what we're going to focus on today. Customer interviews can be used.
Lucy, I've just realized, just on that, do you mind just jumping back for a second?
Of course.
Like what's super interesting for me is that there's this big drive at the moment because everyone can get all this data now. And, you know, there's this trend, like everything's got to be data, made with data decisions. We have to use data. And I know for me, you know, I launched, you know, we were struggling with this feature and trying to get a funnel really, and get a conversion rate up. And we were stuck and we kept looking at data and running experiments and we're getting nowhere. And like the data was useless in that situation. And it wasn't until we went and asked our people, our customers, like, why are you getting stuck, that we learned something. So I'm just curious about your thoughts on this trend and push at the moment of like everything's got to be data backed decisions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, as I said, I think, you know, you really want to use both quantitative and qualitative data to make decisions. Like, as you said, you saw from your analytics that people weren't making it through the funnel, or there was a certain point where they get stuck in the funnel and they're not converting or whatever it is. Well, that helps you identify that there's a problem at that stage in the funnel. It doesn't tell you what that problem is or how you should fix that problem. So then you have to go and talk to customers about that stage in the experience to understand what the challenges are. And maybe it's that feature isn't useful, or they don't understand it, or it misses the mark in some way. But you don't know that unless you go out and ask people. And that's something that data can't really tell you. But you want to use those two things together to help you identify problems and find solutions. Cool. So as I was saying, interviews can be used in product discovery before you have any design or any solution to kind of dig into a problem space, but they can also be used when you do have a design or a solution, along with something like concept testing or usability testing, to further understand how a participant or customer might use your solution. So customer interviews can be very versatile. And I think for people starting their user research journey, building your interviewing skills can be a really great place to start, as it can help with a number of different qualitative research techniques. Unlike quantitative research, where we're looking at numbers and we need some significant data to make decisions, the recommended number of interviews to help people identify strong patterns is around 8 to 10 per customer segment. So that means if you have multiple personas or different types of customers, you want to do around 8 to 10 interviews per customer group. And that should start to give you an indication of strong patterns and themes that you can use there.
Yeah. Now, Lucy, this one's interesting because, I mean, just last week, someone was very senior person was kind of saying like, well, that's great, you've done 10 and 10 people have confirmed this hypothesis, but we need hundreds. We need, I need to make data with hundreds. Like, that's not a big enough sample size. What do you say to someone when they, kind of questioning that number of 8 to 10?
It's common, it comes up a lot, especially with people who are used to focusing on quantitative data where you do have large numbers. But quantitative and qualitative data are very different types of data. One's numbers, one is this really rich data. So for quantitative data, you need a larger sample size of data points to be able to have some statistical significance. But with qualitative data, it's much richer. So you can develop an understanding with fewer data points. So Nielsen-Norman Group, which have a lot of great educational resources on user research. An example they give is if you are watching cars drive down a road and there's a pothole in the road, you don't need to watch 100 cars drive over the pothole to know that that's a problem. You can watch, 5 or 8 cars drive over the pothole, scrape their tires or whatever it is, to know that that's a problem that you need to fix. And it's similar with qualitative research. If you hear about a problem or you witness customers experience a problem 5, 8, 10 times, you know that's a problem that you need to fix. So there are different types of customer interviews. There are structured, semi-structured, and unstructured interviews. So I'm going to talk through what each of these different types are. Structured interviews have carefully scripted questions that are asked to all participants in the exact same way. They often involved more closed-ended questions rather than open-ended questions. And sometimes the interviewer will even have a few predetermined options to choose from, kind of like multiple choice questions. And the interviewer doesn't stray from the script in a structured interview, which means they don't follow up with probing questions. And because of this, structured interviews are not usually used in product discovery or the early stages of design projects because they don't tend to generate new insights. But they can be used when you know a lot about the domain to compare different options. So for example, if you've just launched a new product in a beta program and you want to get customer feedback on it, you might use a structured interview process to get feedback on that. Or if you have 2 different designs and you're comparing which solution is a better fit, you could use a structured interview process to compare those. In a semi-structured interview, the interviewer prepares some questions, and this is usually called a discussion guide. These questions are usually open-ended and they allow the participant to talk freely, and then the interviewer can follow up with probing or clarifying questions based on what the participant has said. In a semi-structured interview, the structure is more fluid, so the interviewer can change the order of the questions on the fly, they might reword the questions a little bit, and they can spend longer probing into a specific area if they're getting interesting insight from that participant. I think that semi-structured interviews are the best way to learn more about a specific issue or area in the experience. I tend to use semi-structured interviews in my process. Preparing the guide helps keep you on track with the conversation and make sure that you have some good quality questions to ask while still giving you the freedom to probe into interesting insights and ask relevant follow-up questions. And then finally, we have unstructured interviews, which is where the interviewer doesn't prepare any questions, but rather comes with some topics that they want to cover. So for example, the interviewer might start the conversation with a really broad question like, tell me about your experience planning holidays, for example. And then the participant would talk and the interviewer would keep the conversation going with non-leading probing questions. Unstructured interviews are usually used when you don't know anything about the domain, so you're doing very exploratory research. but they're actually really difficult to run. It's really hard to come up with non-leading, good quality questions that align with your research goals on the spot. And so personally, I wouldn't recommend this method to someone getting started with customer interviews, but it is something that I see really experienced researchers do in their discovery research practice.
And it's really hard, right? Like you got to be able to bring almost like a kit bag of infinite questions to turn a conversation the way you want it to go without introducing bias or like it's like, yeah, fully unstructured is quite difficult.
Yeah, I think sometimes people maybe don't realize that research is a craft that some people are trained in and experienced in, and they're very good at it. And so I see when I worked at Atlassian alongside a lot of experienced researchers, they would often do unstructured interviews, but it's something that they practice a lot and they're very good at. So I personally lean towards semi-structured interviews myself.
Yeah, because it kind of looks when you're viewing an interview or involved in one or whatever, like it kind of looks somewhat easy, but the amount of prep and stuff you've got to do, especially if you've got you've usually got an objective in mind. You're not just catching up for a chat or whatever. It's definitely an art. I like the craft form.
Yeah, definitely. So easy to have a conversation and not get what you wanted to learn out of it, but that's a waste of time and money. So you want to make sure that you have the right questions to ask. So before you start any of the planning for your research, any recruiting, any writing of questions, it's important to define what you want to learn from these interviews. As we were just saying, it's really easy to go and have conversations with people, but if you're not learning the right things from those discussions, then it's pointless. So experienced researchers will write research objectives in a research plan to help define what they want to learn. And then they'll usually share that and align with their stakeholders to make sure everyone's on the same page on the purpose of the research. Doing this and writing this down and really defining this will help you recruit the right participants, making sure that you get participants with the right demographics and the right background to answer your questions. And it will also help you prep the right questions, the questions that are going to give you the signals that you need for your interviews.
And where does that objective come from in your view, Lucy? Like, is that something, does that come from the product team, from product management? Is it something that the researchers come up with? Like, yeah, how do you arrive at the objective? What's the process?
Yeah, well, in teams where you have all of these roles, I think it often comes from product managers or maybe leaders who, if you're doing more strategic research, or even designers, like, hey, we want to learn how people are using this experience. And then they'll talk to a researcher about that, and a researcher can kind of tease out what exactly you're trying to learn and turn that into research objectives. But if you don't have a full-time researcher, or you're kind of a product manager or a designer trying to hack this process on your own, I think you can still do it. But it's just really about thinking what you're trying to learn from these discussions. And sometimes it's just like for example, we recently did some research where we're working on a new design, a new concept, and it's too early for usability testing. But really what we want to learn from customers is we want to see their first reaction to it and see if they're excited about it. So yeah, really thinking about what you're trying to get out of the conversation is very helpful.
And what's a bad objective?
I think, well, it really depends on the type of study that you're doing. But I think something really granular can sometimes be a bad objective, in the sense that if you are testing a design, for example, or if you want to learn more about someone's experience with a product, you really want to understand the why and the reasoning behind their actions or their thoughts. And so if you have design objectives that are like very surface level, very feature level, that's not really going to help you understand like the pain points and the drive behind why customers are doing that certain behavior.
Yeah, because your objective can almost introduce bias in itself, right? Like if you've got a leading objective, then you're going to end up with leading questions, and
Yeah,
then you'll end up where you wanted to be, but it maybe wasn't the right place that you wanted to be, if that makes, yeah.
yeah, for sure. So once you've kind of figured out what it is you want to learn from this research, you can start planning your questions if you're doing something like a semi-structured interview process. And interviews can be a little bit awkward, especially for participants. They're not really normal conversations. If you think about it from their perspective, they're going to jump on a video call with a person that they've never spoken to before, and that person's going to kind of grill them with questions. And as an interviewer, you want your participant to open up to you, sometimes on tough topics, or at least share their honest opinions and perspective on things. So it's important as the interviewer to ask your questions in a way that allows you to build rapport with your participants so that they can feel more comfortable opening up and being honest with you. And to do this, you can plan your interview questions into 3 categories: human questions, fact questions, and opinion questions. So your first set of questions are these human questions, and they should be aimed at breaking the ice, getting to know your participant, and probably setting some context for the discussion that you're about to have. So questions that I ask here are things like, how's your day going? What country are you based in? What's your role? What kind of work do you do? What company do you work for? These kinds of questions, they're very easy to answer. They're kind of lighthearted and allow us to have a little bit of a chat, but it also gets them used to this dynamic of me asking questions, them answering a question.
I know, and I kind of feel like one of the main things with the human questions is don't ask them in sequential order. Like, hello, what country are you in? I'm in Australia. Okay, how old are you? I'm 18. Or like, and then, oh, hey, what kind of work are you doing? I'm a product manager. Like, don't ask, like maybe explore, like, oh, what's the weather like in Australia? Like, go a bit off piste, so to speak, to let the conversation evolve, because otherwise, yeah, I definitely have seen these kinds of open up the relationship questions get a bit stilted and more awkward. Like it had the opposite effect of creating rapport.
Yeah, totally. Some people write them out and then they're reading a script. But it's quite easy to be natural at this stage. It is a bit more like
Hey, how you going? Yeah.
Yeah, you can also use this time to share a little bit of context about yourself and what you're hoping to get out of the conversation. So I'll usually say something like, I'm a product designer at Dovetail. I'm really about to start this project improving the charts feature, and I'd really like to hear your perspective on charts, or something like that. That just gives them a little bit of context about why you're having this conversation. And then I move on to factual questions, which are questions where there's a clear and indisputable answer. So again, these are relatively easy for the participant to answer, but here you're also building your understanding of their context and their background, which can really help you understand where you want to take this conversation. So for example, questions that I ask here tend to be things like, tell me about your day-to-day responsibilities, tell me about the team that you work with, how does your team work in your organization? And especially if you're doing product research and you want to understand like a person's context so you can understand how they would use your product, these questions are important for your understanding, but they're also easy for participants to answer and helps you build up to these more opinion-based questions.
And just on that, Lucy, because you've got a strong background in like B2B interviewing and B2B products, what are your go-to like fact questions to understand someone's context?
Yeah, I usually ask, what are your day-to-day responsibilities is a good one. because that gets them talking about their role and the kinds of people that they work with, like stakeholders that they interact with.
Yeah.
And then I might ask, another one I like to ask is, how does your team fit into your organization? If you're trying to understand, like, well, at Dovetail, I'm trying to understand how researchers work in organizations. So you can understand, like, are they a siloed research team? Are they distributed in product teams? Yeah, what else do I ask? How do you work with your stakeholders? Try to understand team dynamics.
One of
Yeah,
my
like that.
favorite ones is like, what are the organization's priorities, and then what are their priorities? Because
Mhm.
sometimes you don't feature on there. Yeah, like, no, number one might be like, oh, we've run out of budget because of COVID. So you're kind of like, okay, well, definitely not worth talking about other things at the moment. Or yeah.
Yeah, totally. Another one I ask is, how do you use Dovetail? And that's important for me to know, but it's also kind of an easy question for them to answer. Really, it's not an opinion, it's just, how do you use it in your team? So those kind of questions are good. And then I can kind of learn, like, oh, they're a designer, they're in Dovetail every day, they're using it for this kind of research. That kind of helps me know how they're using the product and how I want to direct the conversation during the opinion questions.
And what are your thoughts on the fact questions that, say I said to you, how much did you spend on on chocolate, because it's the topic of the day. How much did you spend on chocolate in the last month? Or how often did you eat chocolate? And then, like, if we were doing this as an interview, if you asked me, I'd probably say, depending on what mood I'm in, if I'm in like a bit of a health kick mood, I'm going to answer you probably a bit biased on the, like, oh, well, I only once a week. And then if I'm in maybe more realistic, I'd be like, oh, probably every day. Like, how do you think about that with fact questions and interpreting that kind of research?
I think this is where a semi-structured interview is really helpful, because you can kind of start broad, let them talk, and then follow up with probing questions and clarifying questions. And that's where you can sort of drill into the specifics of, like, oh, and what kind of other foods do you eat? Oh, broccoli, carrots. Okay, so you don't eat many sweets, and you can kind of drill into that sort of context
Yeah, yeah,
with those clarifying questions, which is a skill in itself, because you have to really listen to what the person has said and think of those probing questions on the spot, which I think just comes with practice.
yeah.
But that's the benefit of a semi-structured interview.
Cool.
And then you move into asking these opinion questions, which is asking your participant about their opinions, their pain points, and their frustrations with the product or their experience. And this is the real meat of the interview. And this is where you will meet your research objectives, really learning what you were hoping to learn. And these kinds of questions, they require your participant to reflect on their experience sometimes. So that can be kind of a difficult thing for them to do. They have to reflect, but also open up and be honest about their thoughts and feelings on the topic. So these kinds of questions are harder for participants to answer.
And how do you how do you guide your questioning on, kind of like, if you ask someone, actually, no, I'm going to leave it because I know there's something coming. I'm going to leave my
You know
question.
where you're going.
Yeah, yeah.
So by starting with these lighthearted questions and fact-based questions, which are easy to answer, and building up to more open-ended opinion-based questions, you can kind of build rapport with your participant over time and help them to feel a bit more comfortable, kind of like warming them up. So that's generally how I structure my interview questions.
And I also know, you guys, when you're at Atlassian, you guys used to do cupcakes is a way to kind of like fast track the rapport curve, right?
Yeah, if it's in person, it is actually a bit easier, because you can connect with them face to face and give them a cupcake. That always helps. Have a cup of tea or something, like a bit more conversational. It's quite stilted over VC because you like dial in, and if you jump straight into like, what do you hate about the product? Like it doesn't work like that. So yeah, if you're doing it in person, cupcakes are also great. So as I mentioned at the beginning, in a semi-structured interview process, you're likely starting with more open-ended questions and then following up with probing, clarifying questions to dig into the insights that are coming up. And you generally circle from open-ended question to closed-ended question on the various topics. And it's important to be careful not to lead with closed questions or leading questions that can really bias your participants based on your assumptions.
And just to like, open question is how, how do you go to the shops? Or why do you go to the shops? And a closed would be, do you go to the shops?
Yeah, or even people will ask questions like, so do you drive to the shops or do you walk to the
Yeah.
shops?
Like a leading, yeah. Do you drive to the shops? And they're going to answer yes or no, and you've actually learned nothing, because that, yeah, you want more like, how do you get to the shops? And they might explain very differently.
Yeah, you really don't want to do that much talking in your interview as the interviewer. You want to just kind of start with these broad questions, let people talk, and then pick up on things that you want to dig into. I generally move from open question to closed question in 3 stages. The first stage is the discover phase, and this is where I'll ask an open-ended question and open up to a broad range of answers. So for example, I might ask, how do you go about planning a holiday? And then the participant will talk freely. And then we move into the validate phase. And this is where I'll ask probing and clarifying questions based on what they've just said to me. So I might say something like, and why do you choose Qantas as opposed to other airlines? And so here I might dig into what they've said and ask more probing questions to validate my understanding. And then finally, once I think I've got a good understanding of what the participant has said, I'll rephrase or repeat the answer back to them, back to the participant, to make sure that we've built this common understanding. And then I'll move on to the next topic and start the whole process again. So you kind of go from open question to closed question. And your discussion guide, if you're doing a semi-structured interview, will usually be a list of open questions that you'll move through. One of the challenges is you really have to listen, be an active listener to what your participant's saying, so that you can pick up on things to follow up with those probing questions. And that can be quite difficult because if you start with a really broad question, like what are your day-to-day responsibilities? Sometimes you can get people who will talk for 20 minutes, which can be really good. 20 minutes is a long time, but they speak for a long time, and that can be great because you can pick up on lots of things, but you really have to make sure you're actively listening to that and thinking of your probing questions at the same time. So something that I like to do is have a bit of paper next to me and I jot down just keywords or phrases that they've mentioned that will remind me of a probing question to follow up when they're done speaking. When you're doing your research and you're getting feedback on a product or a design, you'll often get participants saying things like, I would really love for you to build this feature. And I'm sure everyone's familiar with this quote, but it's really important to get people to explain why they want that feature in particular. It's really common for participants to solutionize their problems based on their context and their assumptions. Everyone does it. I do it as well for the tools and products that I use. But rather than taking their solution at face value, it's important for you to drill into the underlying pain point and problem that they're trying to solve with that, because you have a different context to them. So it's important to understand that underlying problem. And the best way to do this, I think, is using this technique called the 5 whys technique. It's pretty straightforward. You keep asking why until you have asked why 5 times, or you've drilled into that underlying problem that they're trying to solve with this solution. So this is something that I do a lot. We have Dovetail, we have a Slack community with our customers, and they frequently leave feature requests, which is great as a designer, super helpful. But whenever anyone requests a feature, I ask them why. And I keep asking why until I really understand the problem that they're trying to solve with that feature. Cool. And once you've done all of your interviews, it's time to pull out findings from those interviews to help you make a decision. Often people speak to one person or get one data point from one person they've interviewed, and they want to make changes to the product based off that one data point or one customer interview. But the purpose of having multiple discussions with various different customer types is to identify the commonalities that will help you build a holistic picture of your customer base and make informed decisions to serve many rather than just one. So as I mentioned at the beginning, the recommended number of interviews when you're doing this kind of qualitative research is 8 to 10 interviews per customer segment. And by doing that, that will help you find strong patterns and make informed decisions based off your customer interviews. But that's really hard for a lot of people. Sometimes you speak to one customer and they're particularly passionate, and you just like want to fix it for them, but it's important to pull out common themes. There are lots of different ways to analyze qualitative research, and I think that the method that works best for you really depends on the type of study you're doing, the team that's involved, the different learning styles that are involved, your research experience. So it really depends on what works for you, and this is something that you can experiment with as well. Even myself, I'm always kind of tweaking my analysis process and changing it up for the different types of studies that I do.
And that's, Lucy, you're talking about, whether you're taking notes, whether you're recording and like transcribing, whether you're kind of like pulling out the highlights and putting them into slides or something to summarize for people. That's kind of what you're talking about, right?
Yeah, for sure. And also how you need to communicate the outcomes of this research. Sometimes as the designer, I'm doing the research, but I'm also the person who needs to execute the research, like make decisions based off the research. So I don't need a presentation with supporting evidence and all that if it's just for me, and that can change how you do your analysis and how you find those themes. But, some people are communicating the findings to a group of stakeholders, and they want to include quotes and highlights and little video clips. So that can involve a much more thorough process of analysis. So it really depends. And if you have a look out there, there's lots of different methods. Some of the most common methods, I think, for people getting started with customer research is post-it note affinity mapping, which can be a little bit painful, but you would write down a note or a quote from an interview on a post-it note for each interview, and then you would affinity map those notes on a whiteboard or a digital whiteboard. That's one method. In Dovetail, we have a more grounded approach to analysis in Dovetail, the tool, so you can upload a recording of your interview and it will generate a transcript for you. You could also just put in notes there as well, but we have this tagging mechanism where you can tag parts of the transcript or your notes with a theme, and then you can look at all of the quotes or highlights in that theme. So you could tag a transcript with navigation and then look at everything that people have said about navigation.
Yeah.
So it really just depends on how you prefer to learn, who you're working with, what kind of study you're doing, and requires some experimentation on the interviewer's part.
Cool.
Cool. That is everything that I have for you guys today. Thank you so much for listening. There's so much to cover when it comes to customer interviews. We could go on for a lot longer, but I think we have time for questions as well.
We
Um,
do.
Hope this is a helpful starting point for some of you. And I think, as we said at the beginning, just like anything, interviewing is something that you get better at over time. It is a craft and a skill that you develop. So even myself, I feel myself getting better at it every time I run a research project and practice it.
And I think you've got we're just about to go to questions. I see we've already got some questions coming through, but please put your questions in the Q&A box or into the chat channel, and we'll start getting into them. And I think, Lucy, you've got a special offer for our wonderful audience today from Dovetail.
I do. If you would like to try Dovetail for your own customer interviews and your own research, we have a special offer today, an extended free trial for you all. So if you go to the link that's on the screen, and I think that you'll get emailed this as well, but you can sign up to Dovetail and get 60 days for free. Try it out and see if it works for your team.
Experiment with your process. We'll email the link out to everyone afterwards. And there's some questions. I get the first right of questions, so I'm gonna
Go for it.
ask one that that we covered when we were chatting earlier, but not just now, which is, how do you decide whether to do a structured interview or a survey, and why?
Good question. They can be quite similar, structured interviews and surveys. So just as a reminder, a structured interview is where you have a defined script that you ask every participant, and you tend to not stray from the script. I think a structured interview is coupled really nicely with something like a usability test or a concept test, where you might have some assets to show the participant, like a design, and you want to get their feedback on it. Or even if you have a live product and you want to get their feedback on that, it's a little bit hard to do in a survey, but a qualitative survey can be quite similar if you don't have those like assets that you need to walk a participant through.
Yeah, so it's kind of like, in your view, having to show a complex concept is where you want to do the interview and maybe see reactions a bit more.
Yeah.
Cool. And now we'll kick into some of the questions we've got coming through. Keep them coming, by the way, everyone. So got Damien has asked, first of all, he said great presentation. I agree with that bit. What's the ideal length of time for customer interviews to go for?
I do an hour. I think that's the standard. That's what I've seen most researchers do. Quite a long time, if you have to do 8 to 10 interviews and they're an hour long, that's, 8 to 10 hours. But that's how long it takes when you go through those like fact questions, that can take up to 20 minutes. And then the opinion questions can take another 30 minutes. And you also want to leave some time for if they have questions or feedback on the product that they want to talk about. You have to do a bit of a spiel at the beginning, like, are you happy for me to record this? We're not going to store your data anywhere. And then at the end, you do like a thank you for your time. We'll send you an incentive as a thank you. So there's quite a lot to cover, and you don't want to rush it. If you are paying for their time, you want to make sure that you get what you need out of the interview. So I go an hour, and it usually takes the whole hour, but very occasionally I've wrapped an interview or two up early because they weren't quite the right fit, or for some reason we finished early. You can always finish early.
And I was like just on that, so that like thinking back to your graph with the different parts, it's like doing the human questions, 5 to 10 minutes. If you're going to do it well to build the rapport, and then once you start getting into it, you've got more and more questions that you're going to run through, and then you've got to wrap up, and you can't. It's interesting because you have seen them done in like half-hour slots, but it's a bit more rapid fire, and you can't get deep into a topic. And then on the flip side, I have seen some where you kind of want 2 to 4 hours. You almost want half a day, but that's almost a different concept, right? To your kind of customer interview.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. That does happen sometimes that you do like a co-design workshop with participants.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I think you can't really build rapport with someone over half an hour. It goes so quickly too once you start digging into the topics. So I reckon an hour is the standard.
Cool. That's that one knocked off. Next one is, how many questions do you recommend for a semi-structured interview?
Good question. Um, the human questions, maybe like three. And that is really like ice-breaking kind of stuff. And you can sort of riff on those and make them up and, based on what your participant might say. Like sometimes they're like, what's the weather like in Australia? And I'm like, oh, it's sunny, that kind of thing. The factual questions, I usually have maybe 6 in my discussion guide, and maybe I'll ask, 4 to 6, depending on how they answer them. Sometimes you ask a broad question and they answer 3 of the questions that you had in your list. And then my opinion-based questions, I'll often have a few different sections of them. Like, for example, for a recent research project I did, I had one section drilling into how they do research in teams, and then one section on how they use Dovetail, and then another section on how the purchasing process works in their companies. So they're more based off your research objectives. And in those sections, I might have anywhere from, 6 to 8 open-ended questions in my discussion guide, but I don't always ask all of them. It just really depends on what's relevant for that participant and how they answer the questions. And then, of course, I'll have lots of probing questions.
I was gonna say, yeah, you've got your high level questions, and then you're allowing for, like, you got to allow for your probing, of which you might have like like quite a few, I'm gonna guess, depending on the topic, like purchasing, almost never ending number of, even that topic alone, you could spend an hour on with some companies, but
Totally, that
yeah.
was a tricky one. But yeah, usually I might ask, 3 open-ended questions in a section, and then maybe like 3 then follow-up questions for each.
Cool. All right, so next one will be, shall we build personal relationships with each and every one of our customers and potential customers? I think that one's, if you're interviewing them, you should try to, but it really depends how many customers, this solid product that you've got. If you've got 2 customers, then yeah, you probably should. But if you've got 100 customers, it's too hard to do that kind of thing and do your job as well. Like you just end up having coffee with people all
Mhm.
day, every day. So I think that I'd say that one probably, hopefully, Anna, that answers that one. If we didn't quite answer it and you mean something else, then please yeah, please post another one. Um the next one is, oh, I clicked the wrong button there. All right, so I'm gonna grab one from Leo here. How we deal with the situation when we feel a customer doesn't enjoy the interview session, or probably we come to them not in the right time. Should we reschedule or just go ahead? Yeah, interesting. So like you're getting the vibe they're kind of like, maybe their cat's on fire or something. Silly example, but like maybe they've left something in the oven, or which, maybe they've had a bad day. Yeah, what do you do, Lucy?
That's interesting. I haven't really had that experience where someone seems like they're not enjoying it. I guess if I was in that situation, I would probably offer to reschedule if it seems like they're distracted or something. Or I've had people run late, and like when I'm doing interviews, I'll usually block out 2 weeks for interviews, and I can be quite flexible with my time. So I'll say, like, no problem, let's reschedule for when works for you. I've had participants where you're interviewing them and maybe they're a little bit shy or they're less open, and they kind of give like 1-word responses. and maybe it comes across as they're a bit disinterested in the session. I'm not sure if that's really how they feel, but in that situation.
What did you do then? I mean, I must admit that's haven't probably done nowhere near as many interviews as you have, but like, yeah, that's never happened to me. What do you do?
Super tough. So in that case, where you're getting a participant who's giving like very short answers, not really giving much to your open-ended questions, what I do is I just sit in silence, and people really want to fill silence. People don't like silence. So if you let it just be silent, then
Basically out
they'll
awkwarding.
fill the silence with words, and it's pretty effective, but it's really uncomfortable because I like to
that's
feel
cool.
silence. So yeah, if you just let it be a little bit awkward, then usually they'll jump in with a bit more context.
You're out awkwarding them. I like it. This is good. So the answer is out awkward them. That's cool.
And
All
off.
right. So another there's been two around video calls. So I think we can kind of like knock them off with the one. It's the essence of it is like, are people comfortable with video calls for interviews? How do you build rapport with video calls? Because that's probably what everyone's doing at the moment. Just what are your Zoom interview tips?
Yeah, sure. I've never had a participant not comfortable with video, especially if you set the context when you're recruiting your participants that it's going to be a video call. I've had participants who don't want their screens to be recorded. That's pretty common. If they want to share their screen and show you how they use the product or something like that, they're not comfortable with their screen being recorded. And that's totally fine. Like you can't really do anything about that. You just have to stop the recording, let them show you their screen and take notes. So that's how I do that. Building rapport over video is much harder than in person, of course. I try to think about the participant experience end to end, kind of like you think about the user experience end to end. So from recruitment to scheduling the session to following up just before the session, giving instruction, the session itself, and then after the session saying thank you for your time, giving an incentive or a thank you, like gift card or whatever it is. And I think that can help because they've had some communication and some touch points with you before the session. So at least they know your name. And then I usually know what country they're coming from, what company they're from, and what their role is. So I can use that information to have a little chat with them, like, oh, you're based in the Netherlands, and oh, it's early there right now. Thanks so much for waking up early to chat to me. Things like that, I think just make it a little bit more friendly and less like we're on a call with a random stranger.
Who's probing me with questions? Yeah. All right. So there's another one here. When would you do one-on-one interviews versus a focus group?
Good question. A focus group is really more of a marketing research technique. I haven't really done many focus groups in my time. I'm a bit wary of them because it's quite hard to get participants to be honest, give honest feedback in a group situation. It's just a little bit more awkward. So I haven't really used focus groups, and I don't think they're that common in UX research, but they are certainly common in marketing research.
Yeah, I'm not a big fan of focus groups. You can't. You're not really getting scale. You're not really getting real
Yeah,
answers
not
because
really a
people are
time
looking at
saver.
what everyone else is doing, and then you're also not getting like the signal from the noise. You're not getting that. You're not observing that one car, having issues on the road. You like bumping into something on the road. You're kind of trying to watch 10 cars at once and missing everything. So yeah, it's a interesting one. Just conscious of time. We've got about 4 or 5 minutes left, so we'll hopefully we'll get through the rest of these questions. All right. Any experiences when interviewees talk too much and it was hard to complete the questions? How do you solve it?
Yeah, definitely. This is another tricky one, kind of on the flip side of the person who doesn't say enough. I think like it's important to remember that an interview isn't really a normal conversation, and you're often paying for their time and you've got a set amount of time, and you need to make sure that you're getting out of it what you need to get out of it. So my experience is, particularly when talking to existing customers, that they might have feedback or product ideas or things that they want to talk about. So they usually bring that up pretty early on. They're like, I'm so excited to talk to you because I've got all this feedback. And then I'll say something like, that's really great. I'm really looking forward to hearing about that. I've got some questions to go through first, but I'll leave some time at the end to talk about what you want to talk about, and try to kind of park that, um, and leave that to the end. And then I do make sure that we have time to cover it, or I can follow up with them in email or some other form so that they feel heard. And then you sort of have to interject with your questions if they're kind of going on tangents and talking and talking and talking. Once they start to get off topic, like obviously you ask open-ended questions and you want them to talk, but once they start going off topic, kind of interjecting and asking a probing question to bring them back to the original kind of focus, also can be tricky to do, but it's part
It's
of
a bit of
the
a
craft.
something you got to practice a bit, right? Is my kind of thoughts. So you just got to get a bit used to directing a conversation where you want it to go, and not worrying too much about, like, obviously you want to be empathetic with how you're doing it and doing it with a smile, but just being kind of okay with, like, actually I'm going to completely change the topic, or I am going to cut you off in a nice but professional way, because we there is a job to be done here actually, and we can't keep talking about your cat, so we're going to have to.
Yeah, totally. And sometimes, they'll go on a tangent, they're talking about something else, and I'll say like, that's really interesting. I'd love to talk about that in a moment, but if we could just come back to whatever it is, kind of guide the conversation that way.
Awesome. All right, we got another one, which is, can qualitative research be done by survey? Um, Open-ended responses submitted through surveys. We had a bit of a chat about that, and there's a bit more to the question, which is it too superficial and not able to get below the surface? I guess it's a good one of, like, yeah, where do you use where's that line of, like, survey, all right, now we're going to do interviews. How do you think about that?
You can definitely use surveys to do qualitative research and ask open-ended questions. I think the shortcoming of surveys is that you can't ask probing questions, and you can't do the trick of letting there be silence and getting people to talk more. So once someone's sent in their survey results, really hard to follow up with that
Yeah,
person
yeah.
on what they've said. So it sort of depends on what you're trying to learn. I think for structured interview type scenarios where you're trying to get feedback on a design or a solution or something that's there, it can work in that sense. But the reason I tend to use semi-structured interviews in product discovery and design processes is because you can have those follow-up conversations and really probe into the areas that you want to learn. And surveys just don't allow you to do that.
Yeah, I was going to say the way I've thought about it is always that, how confident are you that you know the topic that you're trying to learn about, and how confident are you, know where the boundaries are and the nature of it? Because if you're not actually that confident and you don't have an understanding of it, and you haven't already done interviews, and the key one is, like, have you done interviews yet around this topic? And if you haven't started broadly, then you can't have confidence to do a survey. A survey is more of a scale. To me, it's right. We've understood this, and now we just want to see if our understanding um, is scalable. So, as in, like, we've learned that two of the people we interviewed said um, that they, procurement in their organization is, research tools is low on the procurement list. Like, it's not in the top three things for budgets. So you're like, okay, well, we heard that from 2 out of 3. The rest said they have no budget. So for those 2 out of 3, like, or at least of our understanding, does that then scale to 500 people? And I feel like that's where you're a survey, you're taking a very specific thing and you're more trying to validate what you've learned versus trying to learn something new. So that, I mean, that's kind of how I've definitely thought about the boundary between survey and interview, at least.
Yeah, I think that's 100% spot on. There's kind of a scale of domain knowledge, and when you know a lot, you do a structured interview or a qualitative survey. When you know something but not everything, you do a semi-structured, and when you don't know anything at all, you do an unstructured interview. That's kind of the theory behind them.
My practical rule of thumb would be, if you haven't done any interviews, you don't know what you do. Like, do not go do a survey. You don't know what you're doing. Like, that's like a very hard objective rule. If you've not done any interviews, then you definitely don't know enough about the problem domain. Having seen a lot of jumps to, oh no, we understand. It's cool. We'll just go for scale. Yeah.
Yeah,
Um,
definitely.
all right. So next one is, if your product is B2B, would you conduct interviews to actual customers as well? I think that one's a pretty, you're interviewing the customers of Dovetail all the time, right?
Mhm.
I've read that question correctly.
Yeah, it depends on what you want to learn. So at Dovetail, sometimes I want to learn how the people who purchase the product make the decision to purchase the product. So the people who purchase the product in enterprise companies are people like heads of research and workplace technology people who are purchasing software for the organization. And when I'm talking to those people, I'm trying to learn about the procurement process, like the decision-making process of what tool you're going to buy for the team. That's the sort of information I'm looking for. But when I'm looking at, the product experience, I want to talk to the end user of the product, which is the researcher in the organization. So sometimes they don't have influence over the purchasing decisions. At least that was particularly the case when I was a designer on Jira. The engineers or the people using Jira they didn't make the decision to buy Jira, but they use Jira in the organization. So I want to hear from the end user's experience. So that's why it's really important to outline your research objectives really early on, because if you want to understand how people use a feature, there's no point talking to the admin who doesn't use the feature. You want to talk to the end user, which could be, anyone from the intern to the admin to the head of research or whoever it is.
And this is in B2B. It's really having a map of who your stakeholders, users, customers, influencers, is a really good place to start. And on that one, there are some good, I don't know, stereotype personas you can almost find anywhere, of like, there is going to be someone from the purchasing team, and there's going to be probably an executive champion, and you can kind of, I guess, what you're kind of touching on there is know who you're interviewing in that context and what their role with the product and relationship to the product is.
Mm-hmm.
Cool.
Yeah.
We got one more question that we'll finish up on because we're running slightly over time, but let's get this last question. It's just on the video calls one again, is, do you find a difference in quality of outcome of your research between phone interviews and video call interviews?
I've actually never done a phone interview without video.
What about
Um,
in person versus video?
uh, I don't think so. Sometimes if you're doing like a usability test or a concept test, it can be kind of nice to have the designs there in front of them that they can touch, or you can sort of walk through them a bit more naturally. But I don't think it makes a difference to the outcome necessarily. If you can kind of adapt your research method and how you run the interview to the medium, then I think they both work effectively.
Cool. We're all done. We got through all the questions.
Cool.
Look, thank you so much for taking us through that, Lucy. That was awesome. I think the number of questions and involvement from everyone listening and their comments as well. I think it was great to have you on. And just for everyone listening, we'll get the email out. The slides will be sent out. The link for the extended trial will be an email, and please just send us an email if you've got any other questions. Thanks so much, Lucy.
Thank you for having
Bye,
me. Thanks
everyone.
for
Thank you, everyone, for dropping in. Bye.